Now, Jim, with the recent destruction of the facade of the 90-something-year-old First Australian Parliament, which at the time was blamed on Aboriginal activists, we find out that it was in fact conducted by the anti-vax pro-freedom movement, as it's commonly become tagged. Now, it would seem that people within that movement are seeking alliances with Aborigines, etc., which led me to think, well, what is our nationalist position on Aborigines?
They commit a major mistake. These people who've attached themselves to the movement that's questioned the vaccination regime and so on, styling themselves as sovereign citizens, they begin with a good analysis in certain areas. They suggest that the Australian state powers should not exercise authority over them, that they have particular inalienable rights deriving from natural law and so on.
And this is them telling the Aborigines.
But they don't see that Australia is a state power, and to be a sovereign individual is in reality the first step only in acquiring state power. The moment you acquire state power, if it is nationalists or anybody else for that matter, we would no longer be sovereign citizens. Our sovereignty is exercised as a collectivity. These people have attached themselves to the Aboriginal 10 Embassy movement and group. By the way, those Aboriginal persons there are a very diverse group of people, and they think a lot of different thoughts. That being the case, some of them have argued that they have a particular sovereignty in Australia outside of Australian state sovereignty, and that they therefore speak for some dreamtime world, and they claim that they don't have to recognise in any way Australian sovereignty. There is an old saying said by mothers to their children, be very careful what you wish for. Any Aboriginal person who did not recognise the legality of the Australian state as it has come down from the British colonial times may place himself in a highly anomalous position should it be that Australia has ever challenged the possession of the continent. Remember, just for the sake of the argument, there was a saying at the time of the Mabo decision. A certain academic at the University of Osaka said it, that the aim of the land rights movement is to make Australian borders porous. Porous? For whom? Aborigines? No. Once you suggest customary right, for the sake of argument, Indonesian fishermen have customary right to fish in Australian waters and trade with certain Aboriginal groups in Arnhem Land and along the Gulf of Carpentaria, where Aboriginal groups certainly did meet Malaccan seamen from about 1300 AD on. If you make the borders more porous, you may as well forget any of the so-called decisions arrived at to discuss land rights. We Australian nationalists recognise that when Europeans arrived in numbers in Australia, the land was certainly occupied by nomadic, tribal groups of Aboriginal persons, subdivided into a number of sub-races, the last of whom entered Australia about 6,500 years ago. They'd come in waves prior to that. Those are the folk who brought into Australia the dog, the famous dingo. We know that Aboriginal settlement in Australia goes back not 40,000 years, but possibly 60, maybe even 80. There are some theories that one doesn't have to accept some of the, I'll say rather wild ideas of some of the men involved in the Jindi Warrabaks, or even the great Australian nationalist P.R. Stevenson, that the hominid form may have even evolved in Australia. and that in reality mankind came from here and blossomed outwards. I myself, I don't accept that theory, but it shows the depth that some Australian nationalists had in attempting to identify with the country that they have adopted as their own. I will also say this, some Aboriginal persons or persons who claim to be Aboriginal and who pop up on the 26th of January often deprecate the manner in which Europeans, Australians who are of European descent, identify with their native land. And they talk about settlers, they talk about settlers like us attempting to adopt even Aboriginal motif or Aboriginal place names or Aboriginal stories into our national story. But the fact is, of course, the continent of Australia is incredibly old, and the Aboriginal peoples were indeed here when Europe settled Australia from 1788 on. But we don't live in a world now where that particular argument between European Australians and the Aborigines, and I'll make here a very, very important point. For the purposes of conducting Australia's affairs internationally, and for the purposes of Aboriginal persons conducting their affairs internationally, it's probably very wise for them to carry an Australian passport. For the purpose of conducting business in Australia that Aborigines must conduct, it's very important that they exercise some sort of legal right to do that. So they consider themselves from that point of view to be Australian citizens. But Aborigines are not Australians, nor are Australians Aborigines. The Aborigines are a unique group of human beings, bottom line finish. They did not live in nations, they didn't live in any manner that most other human groups did. They lived according to their own rules on a continent that they had lived on for millennia. This creates the idea that somehow or other Australian nationalists deprecate Aborigines because they say, well look, we're not you and you're not us. I would have thought that that would be the first point that you would have to admit to in order to deal with each other at all. But according to liberal opinion, somehow or other they're Australians, but they're more Australians than we are Australians. Well, no, we are a nation conceived in the European style, sitting on the Australian continent. And the Aboriginal groups sit on the Australian continent and should be and should remain Aboriginal. We also have the terrible problem of the 26th of January movement. I can imagine that any number of Aboriginal persons may have some grievances of one form or another against aspects of modern Australia. That would go without saying. But the 26th of January movement's an entirely different thing. This is a faked up movement by people who only, generally speaking, have some Aboriginal ancestry, who then claim to speak for Aboriginal Australia. They then claim to speak for all persons who they say are Aboriginal, and they refer to the Europeans as invaders and say that they have no sovereignty and no right. Again, be very careful what you wish for. What is in fact quite ironic about some of these groups is that they actually ally with white folks who actually hate their own ethnicity, they hate their own country, they deny their own identity and advocate refugee migration. Some of these Aboriginal leaders, a certain woman called Williams, European name, is one of the worst offenders. She claims that the refugees and certain migrant groups, they asked to come, whereas the white fellas didn't. So we'll accept all the ones who ask to come, but we won't accept you. Interesting logic. The only question is, how do they ask to come? I didn't see the products of the Punjab or Shanghai or the refugee horde from Afghanistan holding a smoke ceremony with so-called Aboriginal leaders and asking for permission. I didn't see any of that. In fact, I doubt that that's ever occurred anywhere. They simply arrived in Australia with their visas stamped by an Australian government who these so-called Aboriginal leaders do not recognise, but now they say, oh, well, I asked to come, they're okay, but you didn't. Speaking only for myself here, but I know for a large number of other Australians, I have an ancestor who arrived in Australia in chains. She didn't ask either. to come here. She simply was dumped here. We Australians do have, or some of us do, that lineage, regardless of what mixtures of European ancestry we may have. Some of us have some of that lineage. Australia was a penal colony, not necessarily a free settlement. And that's something that the Aboriginal groups on 26 January often also ignore. They ignore the development of a nation here. They ignore also that many men of that nation, and women too, took up arms in its defence at a time when, had Australia been invaded by a certain imperial power, the Aborigines may have found themselves finally and irrevocably cleansed. It's also true that the patterns of migration that now operate in Australia will certainly cleanse the Aboriginal populations. And by that I don't only refer to genuine Aborigines living in remote areas or occasionally in other areas who genuinely do maintain their culture and their biological integrity. The group of 26 January are usually people of some Aboriginal background, which they say entitles them to speak for Aboriginal history for all time. But we can promise them that in the new Australia that's being conjured up by the globalists, there won't be much welfare there. Therefore, to eke out a living as a permanent welfare recipient, crying out for some sort of justice isn't going to occur. What's actually happened is that history, the processes of history, have actually caught up with the 26th of January movement. Similarly too, I don't like to say, it's also caught up with our genuine Aboriginal population. It's caught up because what Australia now faces is something that certainly involves them all. As long as some spokesmen wish to concentrate only on what happened in 1788, they will find themselves just as easily dispossessed. Let's be quite frank. Do we really believe that areas that are set out as so-called land rights gifts are going to be maintained by the mining companies headquartered in Singapore and Shanghai and Mumbai? I don't think so. We'll find that the patterns of agriculture in the north of Australia, the plantation economy that's coming, this plantation economy will wipe out Aboriginal land rights claims. In fact, they're even talking now about revising some of those claims. There is simply no future at all for any group of people who believe that they can avoid that history. I always find it entertaining when capitalist structures and liberal media structures put out this mantra, something about honouring Aboriginal elders past and present, which also includes some people who, in absolute frankness, I'd decline to classify as Aboriginal at all. But allowing for that, they respect them, they say. Do they? I doubt it. But one thing I can say as an Australian is this: I would respect no Aboriginal elder, past or present, unless that person came to realise that unless he understands that his eggs, so to speak, are placed in the same basket as the survival of Australia as a European society, then there is no future for him either. What's coming here is catastrophe. Catastrophe for our people, but parenthetically, catastrophe for his. Will that get through to any of these folk on the 26th of January, the folks on the 26th of January? Well, certainly not the leaders, no. They won't be thinking about that. They'll only be thinking about why they hate whitefellas for this sin or this crime or that crime that they think they know, blaming all things upon whitefellas. Well, it's about time that those leaders, even the ones who are part Aboriginal, took a little bit of responsibility and did a little bit of economic, political, global analysis and realised that the game is up, the game's over. We either defend Australia as a continent and as a state, or we lose it, but they'll most assuredly lose it and inevitably be cleansed. On the 26th of January, Australia First members, myself and many others, will, in one way or another, celebrate Australia Day, the birth of the modern Australian state. The only place that exists that any genuine Aborigine could get anything from anyone won't be the United Nations, it won't be the Declaration on Human Rights, it won't be going to the Human Rights Commission, it certainly won't be going to extreme left-wing whitefellas who crawl around on the 26th of January hating their own race and their own culture and their own background. The only place they could ever come to get a fair deal over anything would be the Australian state. Those are the thoughts that need to penetrate into this Aboriginal movement. Thank you.